Ukraine wasn't supposed to win at sea. That's what made the footage so disturbing. Because when the war began, Ukraine barely had a navy left. Russia, meanwhile, controlled one of the most powerful fleets in the Black Sea: missile cruisers, guided frigates, naval aviation. Billions of dollars of hardware built for one purpose: overwhelming smaller countries before they could fight back. And for a while, that's exactly what happened. Russian warships moved almost wherever they wanted. Cruise missiles launched from the sea slammed into Ukrainian cities. Commanders in Moscow acted like the Black Sea already belonged to them. But then something changed. One Russian ship exploded, then another disappeared from combat, then entire fleets started pulling back from the coastline. And suddenly the strangest question of the war began spreading through military circles. How was a country without a navy slowly defeating one that had one? At first, the answer looked simple: drones, missiles, clever tactics. But the deeper analysts looked, the more uncomfortable the truth became. Because Ukraine wasn't just sinking ships. It was teaching the Russian Navy to become afraid of the water itself, and nowhere showed that fear more clearly than a port city called Novorossiysk. By 2026, Novorossiysk had become Russia's sanctuary in the Black Sea. After repeated attacks closer to Crimea, some of Moscow's most valuable vessels were relocated there, farther from the front line and supposedly beyond Ukraine's reach. The harbor was heavily defended. Radar coverage stretched across the coastline. Air defenses surrounded key naval infrastructure. On paper, it was one of the safest military ports in southern Russia, which is exactly why what happened on the night of May 23 felt impossible. The first reports were confusing. Residents near the harbor started hearing explosions after midnight. Videos appeared online showing flashes over the water, then another blast, then another. Sirens echoed across the port as anti-air systems opened fire into the darkness. But the gunfire wasn't stopping the drones. Somewhere above the Black Sea, small Ukrainian UAVs had already slipped through the defenses and were diving directly toward Russian naval vessels sitting motionless in port. One of those ships was the Admiral Essen, and this is where the story starts to get uncomfortable, because the Admiral Essen wasn't some aging patrol boat or forgotten Cold War relic. It was one of the Russian Navy's showcase warships, a guided missile frigate worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Built with modern radar systems, electronic warfare capabilities, layered defenses, and cruise missile launchers capable of striking targets hundreds of miles away. This ship was designed for modern warfare. It was supposed to survive attacks exactly like this. But that night, video footage showed drones slamming directly into the vessel anyway. One impact struck near the side of the frigate while defensive fire erupted too late to stop it. Reports later suggested multiple UAVs reached the ship successfully. Nearby, another Russian combat vessel, a rare missile hovercraft, was also hit inside the same naval base. For a few moments, the entire illusion collapsed. Because if Ukrainian drones could penetrate one of Russia's most protected naval harbors, then nowhere in the Black Sea was truly safe anymore. And the most dangerous part? This wasn't the first time the Admiral Essen had been attacked. Not the second time either, it was the fourth. That detail changed everything. Years earlier, during the opening phase of the war, the frigate had reportedly already suffered damage during Ukrainian missile operations around the same time the Moskva cruiser was lost. Russia repaired it, sent it back into service, tried to restore the image of control. Then came another strike and another. By March 2026, Ukrainian operators targeted the ship again during a nighttime attack on Novorossiysk. This time, the damage appeared far more serious. Fires reportedly burned for hours. Critical electronic warfare systems were believed to be disabled. Radar components used for detecting threats and guiding missiles may have been damaged beyond immediate repair. For a warship built around advanced combat systems, that was catastrophic. A modern frigate without functioning sensors is almost blind. But before Russia could fully recover, Ukraine returned again in April. Satellite imagery later suggested fresh impacts near the vessel's bow, close to critical sonar and auxiliary systems. Analysts began openly questioning whether the ship could even leave port safely anymore. Think about how absurd that is for a moment. A $500 million warship trapped in harbor because inexpensive drones kept finding it faster than Russia could protect it. And yet somehow, after March and April, Russian commanders still failed to stop May from happening too. 3 strikes in 3 months, not against random infrastructure, against one of the Russian Navy's most important assets. That's not bad luck. That's a system breaking down in real time. But the real story wasn't only about one ship. It was about what Ukraine had quietly become. Because while Russia continued launching massive drone barrages against cities, Ukraine started evolving into something much more methodical. More selective, more patient. Its operators weren't just attacking targets. They were hunting pressure points, fuel depots, radar systems, air defenses, naval infrastructure, logistics hubs, command centers, expensive equipment that Russia couldn't replace quickly. Every successful strike forced Moscow into impossible choices. Move ships farther away, Ukraine extends drone range. Increase air defenses around ports, other regions become exposed, keep valuable vessels inactive in harbor. Then they stop contributing to the war entirely. That's the trap. And it only works once you realize Ukraine may not actually need to sink every Russian warship to neutralize the fleet. It just needs commanders to fear losing them. That psychological shift changes everything, because navies depend on freedom of movement, presence, threat projection. The moment ships become too vulnerable to deploy, their strategic value starts collapsing, even if they remain technically operational. And slowly, that's exactly what started happening in the Black Sea. Russian vessels became more cautious, more distant, less aggressive. Some rarely ventured far from protected ports anymore. Others operated under increasingly tight security restrictions. The fleet still existed, but increasingly it couldn't act like a fleet. And as explosions inside Russia became more frequent, another crack started appearing, not in the Navy but in public perception. Russian military bloggers began criticizing leadership openly. Questions emerged about why expensive defenses kept failing, why drones were reaching critical targets repeatedly, why regions deep inside Russia no longer felt untouchable. Because modern wars aren't fought only on battlefields anymore. They're fought inside expectations, inside psychology, inside the belief that one side controls escalation while the other survives it. And Ukraine was beginning to shatter that belief piece by piece, not with massive armies, not with giant fleets, but with small machines costing a fraction of the systems they destroyed. That may be the most unsettling part of this entire story. For decades, military power was measured in carriers, cruisers, tanks, aircraft, and billion-dollar defense systems. The assumption was simple: the more advanced your equipment, the more secure your dominance. But the Black Sea started exposing a different reality. What happens when cheap autonomous weapons can repeatedly threaten assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars? What happens when hiding no longer works? What happens when the cost of defending a ship becomes greater than the value of deploying it? Those questions matter far beyond Ukraine and Russia, because every military on Earth is watching this happen in real time. And somewhere inside naval headquarters around the world, planners are now confronting a possibility that would have sounded ridiculous just a few years ago. The age of massive warships may not end with one catastrophic battle. It may end with thousands of small drones slowly teaching them they can no longer survive in open water. By the summer of 2026, something strange was happening across the Black Sea. Russia still had ships, still had missiles, still had ports filled with naval hardware worth billions. But the fleet was starting to behave less like a dominant military force and more like a hunted animal. Movements became cautious. Patrol patterns changed. Some vessels reportedly spent longer periods docked under layered protection instead of operating aggressively at sea. Every deployment now carried a new calculation. What if the drones are already watching? That fear didn't appear overnight. It was built strike by strike. And the reason the Admiral Essen story mattered so much wasn't because one frigate got damaged. Warships get damaged in every war. The real shock was that Russia never seemed able to regain control afterward. Every repair cycle created another opportunity for Ukraine. Every relocation eventually became predictable. Every defensive adjustment exposed another weakness somewhere else, and Ukraine kept adapting faster. That's the part many people missed at first. When observers looked at these attacks individually, they saw isolated incidents. A drone strike here, an oil fire there, a damaged radar system somewhere else. But when you step back, a completely different picture emerges. Ukraine wasn't fighting for spectacular one-night victories. It was creating exhaustion, economic exhaustion, operational exhaustion, psychological exhaustion, because repairing a damaged frigate is expensive, protecting an oil terminal is expensive, replacing destroyed radar systems is expensive, moving air defenses across massive territory is expensive, and drones? Compared to all of that, drones are cheap. That imbalance slowly became one of the defining features of the war. For decades, militaries invested enormous amounts of money into platforms designed to survive conventional attacks: missiles, aircraft, naval guns, submarines, armor. But many of those systems were never designed for a world where dozens of low-cost autonomous weapons could appear from multiple directions at almost any time. The old logic assumed defense was stronger than offense. Ukraine started proving the opposite. And once that realization spread, even Russia's own supporters began losing confidence. Some military bloggers openly questioned why critical ports still lacked sufficient anti-drone coverage after repeated attacks. Others criticized commanders for failing to adapt despite months of warning signs. Online discussions became harder for the Kremlin to control because people could literally see the explosions themselves. That mattered more than statistics. Because people can ignore numbers. It's harder to ignore burning fuel depots lighting up the night sky hundreds of miles from the front. And while Russia struggled to explain the growing list of successful strikes, Ukraine kept expanding the battlefields deeper into Russian-controlled territory, not recklessly, carefully. That distinction is important. Ukraine's strategy increasingly focused on systems that sustained the war itself: energy infrastructure, logistics chains, command posts, repair facilities, air defenses protecting key routes. The goal wasn't chaos for the sake of chaos. It was pressure, constant pressure. Pressure that forced Russia to spend more resources defending rear areas. Pressure that stretched air defenses thinner. Pressure that created uncertainty around assets once considered untouchable. And eventually, that pressure started changing the meaning of distance. Early in the war, geography protected Russia. Critical infrastructure far from the border operated with relative confidence because Ukraine lacked the reach to threaten it consistently. But drones changed that equation completely. Now, a target hundreds of miles away could suddenly become vulnerable overnight. A harbor could become exposed. A refinery could ignite. A command center could disappear. And perhaps most importantly, a fleet could become trapped by its own fear of movement. That transformation may end up becoming one of the most important military lessons of the entire century. Because historically, naval power depended on concentration. Large ships operating together created deterrence through overwhelming force. The mere existence of a powerful fleet changed political calculations. But drones challenged that entire philosophy. A swarm doesn't care how prestigious a ship is. It doesn't care how expensive radar systems are. It only needs one opening, one mistake, one missed detection. And suddenly, a vessel designed to dominate oceans becomes vulnerable to machines built in workshops and transported in pickup trucks. That shift is forcing militaries around the world into deeply uncomfortable conversations, not just about Russia, about everyone. The United States is watching, China is watching, NATO is watching. Every country that invested billions into traditional naval supremacy is now studying the Black Sea carefully because the implications stretch far beyond this war. If relatively cheap drones can repeatedly threaten advanced warships in defended harbors, what happens during future conflicts involving entire carrier groups? What happens when autonomous systems become faster, smarter, and harder to intercept? What happens when the offense becomes so affordable that defense can no longer scale economically? Nobody fully knows yet, and that uncertainty may be the most dangerous weapon Ukraine has created, because this war is no longer only about territory. It's becoming a preview of what future warfare could look like, a future where visibility equals vulnerability, where expensive platforms become liabilities, where the side with fewer traditional weapons can still impose fear on a larger military through persistence, intelligence, and adaptability. And maybe that's the final irony of the Admiral Essen story. Russia built the frigate to project power across the Black Sea, but after years of repeated drone strikes, the ship ended up projecting something else entirely. The possibility that modern military dominance is becoming fragile in ways the world still doesn't fully understand. And if that's true, then the scariest part isn't what happened to one Russian warship. It's what happens when every nation realizes the same thing at the same time. And maybe that's the real warning hidden inside the Black Sea. Not that one ship was damaged, but that entire military doctrines may already be becoming obsolete. Because if billion-dollar warships can be pinned down by waves of cheap drones, then the future of warfare may belong to whoever adapts fastest, not whoever spends the most. And the world is only beginning to understand what that means. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories analyzing the future of modern warfare and the technologies changing it forever.